So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to our final session of this afternoon and of this conference. We actually joined two panels here because we shall start with reports on the proceedings of two previous panels which we held. So, and I think I'm in a good position here because I don't really need to extensively introduce our speakers because you already had the pleasure to listen to them in previous panels. But still, I will start from my left. Nuala is the chief legal advisor from AIRE Center, and she will be presenting panel C, which was about the effective cooperation with the civil society. So we shall hear the report from this panel. Then, because Ben Lewis had to leave already to the airport, he was chairing the other panel on implementation of alternatives to detention. But Robyn Sampson was kind enough to take this task, and as you know, she is the chief advisor from International Detention Coalition. And then, after the presentation of two reports, we shall then continue with the very final panel. And let me just introduce again briefly our distinguished speakers. On my right, Mr. Christos Yakamopoulos, Director General of DG1 of the Directorate General for Human Rights and Rule of Law from the Council of Europe. Then next to him, Mr. Tomáš Boček, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe for Migration and Refugees. And then, of course, last but by no means least, Vít Šorm, who is the governmental agent of the Czech Republic before the Court of Human Rights. So with this very short introduction, I would then give the floor straight to Nuala to kindly present the first report.
Thank you very much. I can say what I like about this session because my two co-speakers have both left, so they can't criticize me for missing out something important that they said. We basically looked at the cooperation between national human rights institutions and NGOs, though we did bring in some other stakeholders into the discussions. And we looked at the way in which both national human rights institutions and NGOs could cooperate and collaborate with governments in helping to promote a better respect for human rights in general and the bringing to an end of the immigration detention of children in particular. And one of the things that came out of the discussion was that national human rights institutions, because of their standing, they can go places that NGOs can't always go, and they can get information that NGOs can't always get because of their statutory role in the countries where they operate, and that's very important. And we emphasized the importance of national human rights institutions, although they have a constitutional and statutory role, that they must keep their distance from both NGOs and government, whilst actively entering into dialogue with both of them. And that was a very important issue that came up. Our colleague from Defence of Children International appositely pointed out that that panel at this conference is a wonderful example of precisely the cooperation we were talking about. Governments, NGOs, national human rights associations, international organizations, all aspects of civil society and intergovernmental actors and stakeholders. And we looked at the ways in which NGOs are able to act with a slightly less constrained mandate than national human rights institutions. And Benoit very conveniently saved me a lot of trouble by making 6 very good points. He said the cooperation must be strong, it must have clear visions and goals, it must be professional, a prerequisite of being taken seriously, it must be self-critical, very important, there must be a clarity of the roles of government, NHRIs and NGOs, and they must sit at a round table with the government. And we emphasized that it was all about dialogue and that cooperation doesn't necessarily mean agreement, and mostly doesn't. We had a lot of very interesting questions, including some people who were asking whether or not it was possible for you to cooperate with the government whilst you were criticizing them and monitoring them, and we all agreed, yes, this was a very important cooperation, that they should be seen as NGOs and national human rights institutions should be seen as the partners of the government, even though they were not partners in crime, as one of the speakers said. So we covered a whole variety of issues, including looking at the role of litigation and the role of providing assistance and support, the role of bringing people together, and we concluded, I think, that the cooperation between national human rights institutions, NGOs and government was a good thing and should continue in a positive and constructive way. Curiously, and I leave this for you all to think about, nobody mentioned the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting the debate and discussion you had in the panel on engagement with the civil society, with the cooperation with NGOs and other actors. Perhaps I would then, I assume there are no questions at this point, and we can then go straight to the presentation of the second panel, and I would give the floor to Robyn Sampson.
Thank you. In our session, really we had 2 in-depth examples of processes of change. The one was from Austria with Eva Pfleger, who works with the Ministry of Interior there, which has gone through quite a significant process of change, moving away from the detention of children to alternatives. And then we had Katarina Slubik from SIP in Poland talking about a new project that they're working on and the beginning of what is hopefully going to be a significant story of change in Poland. In the case of Austria, I found it very interesting to hear about the process of change that occurred since 2006. And there was a particular turning point in November 2010 when a family who was returned to Kosovo for reasons unknown to the speaker seemed to be a story picked up by the media. It was just mentioned as a gap in conversation. But in this case, this caused the country to really take stock of its detention and deportation practices. And in doing so, they amended the law so that children under the age of 14 have an absolute prohibition on their detention. This is in the returns context because asylum seekers cannot be detained at all in Poland. And then for the 14 to 16-year-olds, it's almost impossible to fulfill the requirements needed to detain them, so it's very rare. And then the 16 to 18-year-olds, it remains possible, but it is a rare occurrence because there's a strong favouring of alternatives to detention. So the way in which this law was then implemented was the development of an alternative to detention. There was a disused property, which was a large house made up of several apartments, Each apartment can house a family, for instance, 2 adults, 2 children. They're free to leave the property. They do have some restrictions or conditions on them, which include living at the residence and reporting requirements to police, but they are free to come and go from the property. An NGO provides return counselling, and they do find they occasionally use detention at the very end of the process for a maximum of 72 hours, and they've been experiencing or having about 1 or maybe 2 families a week detained in that stage of the process. They clearly used assessment of the individual family and the family to determine what measures were required, because alternative to detention measures were also needed to be approved in a court decision. Separately, in Katerina's examples of the change that will hopefully be occurring, it comes out of their participation in an alternative to detention implementers network, which I'm very proud to say that the IDC is supporting. It's a very exciting development. This is an example of NGOs feeling that they did not want to wait for the states to step up and really introduce alternatives, because they were finding it too difficult to make the changes from outside. So it's a network of NGOs who are each developing a concrete pilot project of an alternative to detention in their country, and the aim is to test what factors are those that create the best outcomes from the community setting. Excuse me. This was just started in March 2017, so it's very new. It has confirmed projects in Cyprus, Bulgaria, Poland, and the UK. It's supported by IDC and PICM, who most of you will know. And then there's financial support from the network of European foundations. So in Poland, the focus is going to be on people in the return procedures, which can include families. It's not limited to families, however. And the focus is on engaging them in their procedures, empowering them, developing trust in the process, supporting them with legal advice and other supports, working towards a resolution of their migration matter, and offering psychological support. They have a team with lawyers and counsellors to support the families and other participants. And it's really based on the CAP model, which was mentioned earlier, that's in the IDC's There Are Alternatives handbook, if you want to look at some of the factors that influence the structure of their project. They're very much interested in taking an individual approach. So rather than seeing all these people as returnees, seeing them as people who have a whole range of motivations that might be affecting their migration. They might have different issues affecting their daily life. They might have health issues, mental health concerns, and the approach is very much to understand the person and their setting to then work with them towards an outcome. I think in the questions we had some very interesting discussions. I think the kind of crucial or crux of many of the questions were actually stem from the disbelief that you really can convince people to choose to leave a country when they've invested so much in irregular movement in the first place. So there were a number of different questions that essentially were trying to tackle that question. The main kind of pieces of advice we had, particularly from Austria, where this has been in place for some time, is the significance of trust in the system, that the person has really explored all the options to remain in the country legally. And they we talked about the fact there's quite a lot of belief in the quality of asylum decisions taken in Austria. So in most cases, there's not a remaining concern that the person would be exposed to persecution upon return. So their remaining choice is one of irregular stay or a choice to return to their country of origin or citizenship and try to start life again on return. So the question ends up being about what kind of choice they want for their life ahead of them, and it is a surprisingly compelling choice for most people. As part of that exploration, there is a focus on the consequences of the different choices. So if there's a choice to remain in the country in an irregular manner, what kind of life will that lead to? What will the children experience? Will they be able to get the education they deserve? Those sorts of things. And then also if they choose not to return or depart the country independently, then what are the consequences of a deportation process? For instance, deportation ends up with certain marks against your name, and often, for instance, in Austria, it has a ban on travel in the future, and this is often a significant issue for people who may want to return to see friends and family in the future. So there was some real in-depth discussion, I guess, about these different strategies for the nature of those conversations, and we were trying to explore them in some detail to understand why it is really possible for the majority of people to choose to leave without relying on detention and deportation. I'll just check if there are any other main questions that we wanted to flag. There was a question about the struggle of placing someone who claims to be a child into the facilities for children, unaccompanied minors, when there are concerns that they are much more likely to be found to be an adult. So when you have a young man who looks to be 25 saying he is a minor, so there was a discussion about how to handle that to ensure all children in those centres are protected. So there was clearly the need to treat all people who claim to be a minor, even someone like myself, who I have a 0 birthday later this year and could not claim to be a minor perhaps, but even if I did, then I would need to be placed in this accommodation facility for children. But the strategy they have in Austria, and they were open to other suggestions if there are other solutions, was that there are 2 sections within the centre. One are for children who are clearly children, and one section are for the much older looking children who potentially may be found during the age determination process to have been older than they claimed. And I thought that was an interesting specific suggestion moving forward. I just might wrap up the summary by talking about some of the broad outcomes. So one was both presentations really highlighted some of the solutions available and the need for us to look for them and develop them when required. And particularly, I think we noticed, or I noticed the examples approach working with children from an ethic or principle of care rather than enforcement. And I think that would certainly lead to much better outcomes, not only for the children's health and well-being in terms of their treatment, but also in terms of outcomes with their cases. Another point that we explored was which institution might be best placed to take these developments forward. In the sense, I know the other session was looking at the role of NGOs in this, and we had an interesting example here of one presenter talking from the perspective of an NGO who is taking this upon themselves to test essentially on behalf of a government, and one from the perspective of a government who has had a decision made not to detain children and then needed to look to find ways to make that happen. So different contexts required different institutional responses. And then the third thing was the honest engagement with people, especially when we get to the point of talking about a return process. there was a clear need to make sure there'd been very clear and consistent communication with people throughout their processing of their claims. And there was some discussion around the role of broader support groups in ensuring that people are actually understanding the process they're going through and not being given false hope about what outcomes might be before them. If it ends up falling only to the authorities to explain the reality of the situation, it usually doesn't do the migrants and refugees any favours. So there was a broad discussion about how a sector can all contribute to helping people understand the realities of their situation moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And since I was present during this second panel, I can personally confirm and certify that this was a very accurate description of the issues we thoroughly debated in this second panel. So again, thank you to both rapporteurs for summarizing two previous panels.